Bildad the Shuhite insists, God is so powerful and we are so weak. How could any of us ever be pure before God? And yet Job admits, yes, Bildad, God is powerful and we are weak, but I still insist I am innocent. I didn't deserve this calamity that came on me. Let's open the Bible and think on these things. This is the Word of Truth Ministry video library. I am Nathan C. Johnson, Bible teacher. I greet you in the faith and fellowship of our great God and Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, whose we are, whom we love, and whom we serve. Let's open our Bibles to the book of Job and chapter 25. And today we will be discussing the third and final address of Bildad the Shuhite. Remember that Bildad argued, especially in his first address, his argument was from human tradition. What people have always said, what the father said, what they argued. And in Job 25 verse 1, we have, Then Bildad the Shuhite answered and said. Or we could make that Bildad the Shuhite concluded and said, because this was his conclusion of his argument, his third and final address. What does he say, verse 2? With him dominion is and reverence. 'Tis he who maketh harmony on high. So Bildad argues God's great and high status. He says that he has dominion, ultimate rule and authority, and reverence, all true respect and fear belong to him by right. 'Tis he who maketh harmony on high. Now, harmony there is actually the word shalom. Shalom is the Hebrew word for peace or harmony, wholeness, soundness in relationships and in life. He says he makes shalom on high in heaven. Well, question, was Bildad right? Is there harmony in heaven? Remember we saw in the first two chapters of the book, Satan in heaven causing trouble. Not harmony. Verse 3, the number of his armies, who can count? Ye upon whom ariseth not his light? So he argues of God that his armies are beyond counting. His armies are numberless. His troops are numberless. Ye upon whom ariseth not his light? He created the sun, so his light arises on all. So Bildad is basically arguing God is great and omnipotent. He has all power. He made all. He's beyond all of us. What's his point in that? Verse 4. How then can mortal man be just with God? Or he be pure who is of woman born? So his question then is, how then could an enosh? And enosh there, that's the word for man that means a mortal man. Man is weak and subject to death. How can an enosh, a mortal man weak and subject to death, be just with El? That's God, the mighty God, the all-powerful God. How could an enosh be just with him? Or he be pure who is of woman born? How could a woman-born man be pure before God? Now I can't help think that Bildad is struggling a bit here. He's out of his depth. His argument here is only 5 verses. It's very short. It's the shortest of anyone's argument. And so Bildad appears to be struggling. He's running out of things to say. It's his turn to say something, but he doesn't have much to say. So he falls back on mocking Job's claim to have been right and been pure and done right, claiming that no one could do that, Job, because God is great and we're small, so how could we be pure with him? Well, Bildad overall doesn't strike us as the smartest of the 3 friends. He's kind of showing up that his intelligence isn't maybe quite up to this conversation. And his third address is short and not very convincing. But verse 5, behold the moon, to him it shineth not. The very stars in his sight are not pure. So he says, next to God, his light, the moon doesn't even shine. And next to God, his purity, the stars even aren't pure. Verse 5, how much less mortal man? the food of worms, or any son of man, himself a worm? So he says, Enosh, mortal man, man is weak and subject to death. He's certainly less pure than the stars and the moon. Ultimately, mortal man is the food of worms. Of course, he's just borrowing what Job had already said. And the son of man, that's Hebrew Ben Adam. The son of Adam, or the representative of Adam, he says, is equivalent to a worm. So he says, you can't claim to be pure, Job, because you're just an Enosh, a mortal man. You're just a Ben Adam, a son of man. And how can anyone who's such be pure? Again, not much of an argument. And Bildad appears to be out of his depth. Chapter 26. But Job answered and said, or Job replied to Bildad and said, verse 2, how hast thou helped him who hath no power, or succor brought to him who hath no strength? So Job's friends throughout have argued their superiority to Job. But Job now puts Bildad to the test. He says, Bildad, you have blamed me. You and your friends have blamed me for ignoring the powerless and the weak, not supporting the defenseless. But I have a question for you, Bildad. How have you helped the powerless? How have you supported the weak and defenseless? I did those things. But Bildad, you sitting there on your high horse in your righteousness, I know that you haven't. Verse 3, how hast thou counseled him who is unlearned, or hast made fully known the thing that is? So, Bildad, when did you ever go out of the way to advise those who are ignorant, or reveal truth to those who didn't know it? So it seems that Bildad has a glass jaw. That while his friends are there accusing Job, and some of their accusations are, you might have ignored the poor and oppressed and not helped the weak and not taught the ignorant, when Job absolutely had done those things. And yet these friends are accusing him. Job has known all along that Bildad has not done these things. Bildad is the kind of rich, powerful man who doesn't support the weak and who doesn't educate the ignorant and who is uncaring about the poor and impoverished who are under him. And this kind of amazes me at Job's restraint, at Job's gentlemanliness, that as these friends have been slinging mud at him and accusing him, this whole time, of course, he's known that Bildad is the very kind of person they've been accusing him of being, and yet Job hasn't brought it up before this. And yet now Job is sick of it. And Bildad has accused him once too many, and so he shows up Bildad and says, Bildad, you should talk. I know you, that you're the kind of person who does ignore the weak and the ignorant. Verse 4, by whom hast thou been taught to speak these words? Whose inspiration hath come forth to thee? So he says, Bildad, who taught you to spout these platitudes you're spouting? Whose spirit, the King James says, but that's actually the word for breath, neshama, what God breathed into Adam's nostrils that made him a living soul. It's not ruach, the usual Hebrew word for spirit, but neshama. Who breathed these arguments into you? Who inspired these arguments? Remember that Bildad based his argument, when he started out anyway, on human tradition. This is what the father said. This is what they all say. And Bildad claims, I just taught what the fathers taught. So now Job says, yeah, I know you taught what the fathers taught, Bildad, because that's the only way you could teach anything. That's the only intelligence you have. You're an unthinking simpleton, Bildad. And all you can do is just spout the wisdom of others. You have no wisdom of your own. And this is what Job accuses Bildad of, and probably justly. And like I say, we can only marvel at Job's restraint, that this was an obvious argument to bring about against Bildad the first time, and yet Job was too gentlemanly to do it. But now, he strikes Bildad's glass jaw, and I think shuts him up for good. But still, he's going to answer his argument, even though he showed Bildad to be a hypocrite. Verse 5, where stay the mighty Rephaim of old, beneath the sea and things that are therein. Now the King James translates this, dead things are formed from under the waters and the inhabitants thereof, which makes little sense. Well, what it actually says in Hebrew is the Rephaim. And the Rephaim are giants. And we learn in Genesis chapter 6 that the sons of God, angels, saw the daughters of Adam, that they're fair, and they came down and had children with them as they chose. And these became the Nephilim before the flood. And yet there were also some of these after that, after the flood. And after the flood, they're called Rephaim. But Job seems to be speaking of those before the flood. The Rephaim of old, the giants of the ancient world. He says, where do they stay? Beneath the sea. And they were all drowned by the flood. They're dead, they're buried. They probably helped turn into the oil that we use to power our cars. But these Rephaim, they're all gone. And why does Job mention this? Because he's going to go into God's power too. He says, you talk about God's power? Let me tell you about God's power, Bildad. Where are all the mighty Rephaim, the giants of old? Under the sea where God put them. Verse 6, open before him, Sheol naked lies, and deep Abaddon hath no covering. So Sheol, the state of death, again with resurrection in view. Of course, it's hidden, it's inaccessible to us, other than, of course, by death and going into it by death. But apart from death, Sheol is inaccessible to us. Much as we'd love to go into Sheol and bring our loved ones out of it, we can't. And yet Sheol lies naked and exposed before God. And Abaddon, destruction. Death with no resurrection in view. Again, covered over, inaccessible to us. We can't decide if someone is going to live again or not after they die. Yet it's uncovered and open to God. Now I believe so far only the Rephaim are in Abaddon. Someday God will consign wicked men to Abaddon when he judges them. But until then, only the Rephaim, this half-human, half-angel, abhorrent mixture, God has consigned to Abaddon, and they'll never come out of it. But even Abaddon is open to God. Verse 7, the north he stretches o'er the empty space, and hangeth not the earth on anything. Now, the north. What we think of as the north of being the top of the earth. So like a globe, if you were going to hang the earth, you'd hang it from the north. But that wasn't the ancient way of looking at it. They actually looked at the primary direction as the east, the sunrise. And all their directions were east. South was right, north was left, and west was behind you. So north doesn't necessarily mean where the earth is hung. But the Bible seems to indicate in several verses that the north is where heaven is. Heaven is in the north. God's throne is in the north. And so there's reference to the north here may be to the place we call heaven. The planet that's heaven, I think it probably is a planet, just like the earth is a planet. So heaven, just like the earth, is stretched over the empty space. It's hung on nothing. Of course, there's no physical thing that holds the earth in place. It's not on a giant turtle like some silly, superstitious ancients thought. But Job knows it's hung on nothing, not on anything physically solid. Gravity, we would say. Now notice that the ancient Job wasn't ignorant of cosmology. He didn't think the earth was on a turtle's back or held up by some giant man or something like that. He knew it was hung on nothing. And he thought that the north, probably heaven, is the same way. Verse 8, he bindeth up the waters in thick clouds, and yet the clouds beneath them is not rent. So he takes water and he puts water in the sky and binds it in the clouds. Yet if you took water and put it in a giant vessel and put it up in the sky, your vessel would probably tear if it had as much water in it as the clouds have, and yet the clouds never tear open. They hold the water and they're never torn. Now how does this work? Well, we know the water table. It all has to do with how water functions. Science tells us all that. But the point is, this is the brilliance of God's creation. A human being couldn't have thought up this way to keep water in the sky and clouds. God thought it up. That's how brilliant he is. Verse 9, he closeth fast the entrance to his throne, and over it he spreadeth his dark cloud. So there is an entrance to God's throne, and the Bible seems to indicate that there's a pathway from the earth to God's throne in heaven. And it seems to indicate that the angels have access to and can regularly traverse this route. Jacob saw them traveling in Genesis 28 and verse 12. And he dreamed, and behold, a ladder set up on the earth, and that could also be a stairway. The top of it reached to heaven, and behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. So this pathway from the earth to the place where God's throne is, heaven, and the angels travel it regularly. It's accessible to them. And yet, to Adam's race, God closed fast the entrance to his throne, and over it he spread his dark cloud. He covers it with darkness. We can't see it. We can't find it. Now, I think perhaps someday God will remove this darkness and allow us access to this corridor. And we will be able to travel then between earth and heaven, where God's throne now is. But for now, he hid it from us. The angels know where it is, but we don't. It's hidden. But God is that powerful. He can do that. He can create a way to travel between earth and heaven, and yet hide it from Adam kind, even though angel kind knows where it is. Verse 10, the round horizon bounds the water's face, and there the fading light with darkness blends. So the round horizon bounds the water's face. So we can see the water being bounded by the horizon. Of course, that's because the earth is a sphere, and the water goes down at the horizon, into the horizon, because the earth is a sphere. And the light blends with the darkness at that same horizon, of course, as the sun goes down. And all these things are showing God's greatness in creation. Verse 11, the pillars of the heavens he makes to rock, and they are terrified at his rebuke. Now, pillars hold up things. And this could be speaking very poetically of a storm in the sky. And interestingly, throughout the end of this discourse, and especially during the discourse of Elihu, the last one to speak later on, after Job and his three friends are done, while he speaks of a storm, and it seems that a storm is brewing, and then God speaks to Job out of the storm. Yet I would tend to think this is a little early for the storm to already be brewing, since it's chapters and chapters yet before it finally breaks and God speaks. But I would point out that heavens can also refer to exalted beings. And it often does in the Bible. The rulers in the place called heaven are heavens. The rulers on earth are heavens, exalted over the earth. Heaven means heaved up or exalted, lifted up. And the things which hold up the rulers, God can cause us to rock. A nation is stable if the rulers are stable in their rulership, and yet God can rock the pillars that hold them up. And they're terrified at his rebuke. Of course, the sky can't really be terrified, and yet rulers can. So they're terrified when God rebukes them, when he scolds them in his anger. Verse 12, by his great power he calms the raging sea, and by his wisdom he subdues the proud. So God has power over nature, like the sea. And this reminds me of Christ calming the storm. Peace be still. And the storm is instantly still. And he has power by his wisdom to subdue the proud among living beings. So he has power over nature, and he has power over men. Wisdom here is a word repeated. By the wisdom of his wisdom, or by the understanding of his understanding, he subdues the proud. They can't stand up to him. Verse 13, the heavens so fair his spirit beautifies, the serpent constellation he hath formed. He says he beautifies the heavens. And we have to admit the heavens in the sky are beautiful. The sun, the moon, the stars, these great heavens over our sky, they're beautiful. And yet, his spirit beautifies them. And again, if we're talking of the heavens as the rulers, many of our human-created rulers are ugly. They're ugly in corruption. They're ugly in tyranny. They're ugly in selfishness. And yet God's Spirit beautifies the rulers if they rule by his Spirit. And this has always been true, and it's still true. A ruler who rules by God's Spirit is beautified by his Spirit. Then the serpent he hath formed, and this refers to the serpent constellation, like Bullinger has it. Serpent here is Nachash. The Nachash is the shining one, or the hissing one. And it's the same word that's used for Satan in Genesis chapter 3. Now here the Nachash refers to the serpent constellation. And of course, the serpent constellation, like all the heavens, was formed by God the Creator. Now, what the King James has as the crooked servant, the Hebrew is actually the fleeing serpent. And this reminds me that the New Testament promises, resist the devil and he'll flee from you. And he is indeed the fleeing serpent. Verse 14, lo, these are but the outlines of his ways, a whisper only that we hear of him. His wondrous power, who then can comprehend? So all these things that Job lists seem incredible to us. Bildad, in his paucity of words, could little speak of all God's power. Job pours out God's power. Says, I can say more about God's power than you, Bildad. And yet all these things I've said, they're just a brief outline of his ways. All the little details that could be filled in are just beyond our talk now. Think of all that science still doesn't comprehend about God's creation. And the fact is we hear just a whisper of the full volume of God's truth. We can't comprehend just how powerful and great and awesome and mighty and wise our God is. Job speaks a great truth here. He says, Bildad, you haven't said you haven't said nearly what I could say about the greatness of our God. So this is the first half of Job's answer to Bildad's address, and yet Job's answer to Bildad's third address is that God is powerful, but Job is righteous. Bildad argued, God is too powerful for any of us to say we're righteous. Job says, yes, God is powerful, but yes, I am righteous. Then verse 27, moreover, Job continued his parable and said, so Job now adds more words to what he already said. He continues his answer to Bildad. And again, like I said, the first half was, God is powerful, like you say, Bildad. In fact, you didn't say a fraction of it. I can say much more. But your second half is wrong. You said nobody could be righteous because God is so powerful. I am righteous. And here's how he said it. Bullinger's translation, moreover, Job did add these words and say, as God doth live, who takes away my right, e'en Shaddai, who hath so embittered me. So he adds to his words and says, as El doth live, the mighty God. So he says, as El doth live. So he is swearing here. He's taking an oath. He's taking an oath. He says, as El lives, who takes away my right. What right is this? Well, basically, when someone has a quarrel with someone else, the person has a right to know what the accusations are, right to know what the charges are. We have that in our law. The accused has a right to know what the charges against him are. But he says, God took away my right because I don't know the reason for his quarrel with me. I don't know what the charges are. But he swears, as El lives, who's took away my right, even Shaddai, the all-bountiful one, who has so embittered me. Now you'd expect the all-bountiful one, the Shaddai, to cheer you. And yet instead, Shaddai has embittered Job by his actions. Again, Job is assuming all Satan's actions are God's. Verse 3, so long as breath remaineth in my mouth, and in my nostrils is Elohah's breath. So he continues his oath. As long as he lives and has God's breath in his nostrils. God here is Elohah, the venerable God, the God who's worthy of being worshipped. And breath here this time is not neshama, as last time, but ruach. And that is the word typically translated spirit. And the spirit grants life and intelligence to those who have it. So as long as in my nostrils is Elohah's spirit, he says, these lips of mine shall not perverseness speak. My tongue shall never utter what is false. So he continues his oath. Job is swearing by God that as long as he lives, he will not speak what is wrong and what is false. So what does he mean? Well, he is again going to refuse to agree with his friends that he has been impure and that's why he suffers. He says, I refuse to do it. I swear by God that I won't speak falsehood as long as I live. What does he mean? Verse 5, no, never will I grant that you are right, nor will I live my innocence let go. So he swears that he will never speak wrong by admitting that his friends are right. Job said, if I admitted you are right, it would make it look like, oh, okay, there's a way out of this. Since I did something wrong to deserve this, I can undo it. But he says, I swear I will never do that because that would be falsehood. Instead, while I live, I'll insist on my innocence. I'll never start lying and admit that you're right. I'll always say the truth and I'm innocent. So he's saying, in light of God's greatness that I just talked about, how can I respond by lying about my own conduct? In light of God's greatness, what can I do but refuse to speak falsehood? And it would be falsehood to agree with you that I deserve my fate because of something I did. So he says, in light of God's greatness, I insist on the truth that I'm innocent. That's what God's greatness drives me to. It's not going to drive me to lie and say that you're right. It's going to drive me to tell the truth and say that I didn't do anything to deserve this. Verse 6, my right I hold. I will not give it up. My heart shall not reproach me all my days. So he says he'll hold on to his righteousness. He won't give it up just because that would be convenient, because he could claim then there's a way out of this. He says his heart, his inner being from which his motivations come, does not reproach him. He says, I know in my heart, in my inner being, that I didn't do anything to deserve this. I know what I did and why I did it. And so I know I didn't do anything to deserve it. You're just guessing and hoping as long as you sling mud at me that some of it will stick. But I know I'm innocent. Verse 6, e'en were the evil one mine enemy, and he the unjust should my accuser be. So this is very interesting because Job here gets the closest that he or any of his friends actually get to the truth, which was that his enemy and accuser was not God but Satan. Now Job doesn't seem here to actually think that's the case, that the evil one is actually his enemy and that the evil one is actually his accuser, the unjust one is accuser, but he postulates it. Even if he were my accuser, even before him I wouldn't admit that I actually did wrong, and I won't admit it before you either. Well, interesting, the evil one was his accuser. The evil one was behind the friends and the accusations they were bringing against Job. And Job inadvertently strikes at his actual enemy here, but all the while not realizing it. Verse 8, what hope is left the godless man? What gain, when once Eloah doth his life demand? So Job starts on a new track. He says, what hope does a lawless man have if Eloah, again, the venerable God, the God who deserves to be worshipped, what hope does he have when God demands his soul? And this is soul here, nephesh again. Now we would put it that God demands his life, like Bullinger translated it. That's our English way of saying it. Well, that's not God's terminology. In God's terminology, you can't lose your life. Just like you can't lose your air. I mean, the air isn't hurt when I die, I just stop breathing it. And in their way of thinking, the life wasn't hurt when you die, you just stop living it. The life is still there, it's just you aren't experiencing it. But what you lose is your soul. But we don't have this idea. We have this ridiculous philosophy that souls are immortal. So we talk about our life being in danger, not our soul. But that was not Bible's terminology or God's. But once Eloah demands his soul, what can the godless man do? Verse 9, will God indeed give ear unto his cry when trouble or distress on him shall come? So will God, and this is again El, the mighty God, the all-powerful God. Does he listen to the cry of the godless when he's in trouble? No, he doesn't. Yet Job, of course, has claimed to be righteous. God ought to listen to him if righteousness means God should listen to him. And yet God doesn't listen to Job either. Verse 10, he is not one who doth in Shaddai joy, or on Eloah calls at any time. So this lawless one Job is talking about doesn't delight in Shaddai. Again, the all-bountiful God, the God who could give him good. He doesn't call on Eloah, the venerable God who deserves to be worshipped. He doesn't bother to worship him. But of course, Job did joy in Shaddai, and he did call on Eloah. He's not like these wicked ones, and he insists that he's not. Now, I don't believe for a moment that Job was done with this point that he started in verse 8, talking about the godless man. He was going to bring it around, of course, to say that God wasn't listening to him either, even though he did joy in Shaddai and call on Eloah. Was probably where his argument would have gone, but we don't know, because I believe here Job gets interrupted. And really, something strange happens here, and the expositors have trouble with it. Because Job has just sworn in chapter 27 that he will never admit that his friends are right. And yet suddenly, he seems to completely reverse course and say, yeah, but you're all right. And this puzzles the expositors. What is going on here? Well, I claim that what happens here is that Job is interrupted. Zophar cuts him off and begins his third address. And most people don't think Zophar has a third address. I do. And I'll discuss this and why I think it's so in our next study. But in this portion, Bildad argues that God is powerful and man is impotent. So no man can really claim purity before God. So you can't either, Job. But Job points out what he's restrained himself from pointing out so far, that Bildad has a glass jaw. That Bildad hasn't gone out of his way to help the poor. That Bildad hasn't done anything to instruct the ignorant. And these are some of the very things his friends accused Job of doing to deserve what was happening to him. And yet that's really how Bildad acted. And here Bildad is sitting there as one of his accusers. Bildad admitted he was teaching what his fathers taught, so Job claims he's just a parrot, inspired by others to speak words of more intelligent men than he is himself. Then Job admits Bildad's argument, and he doubles down on regarding God's greatness. But he denies Bildad's argument, and he says, in light of God's greatness, I can't lie and say I'm guilty like you claim I am. I can't say that I deserve what happened to me like you claim I do. In light of God's greatness, I have to tell the truth that I'm innocent. He was going to make another point about godless men, but it got interrupted. And we'll talk about that interruption in the next argument in our next study. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please press like or comment below. And those likes and comments to help this video get promoted. So if you do that, thanks. We appreciate it. Until we gather again around the pages of God's book, I thank you for watching, and I bid you goodbye.